The starship Avalon from the Homestead Company is transporting over 5,000 colonists and 238 crew members to the planet Homestead 2, a journey that takes 120 years. This is being done as part of a mass exodus of Earth's population due to ecocide and the collapse of the biosphere. The colonists and the entire crew are in hibernation pods. Still, as the ship passes through a large asteroid field, the ship's energy shield, which is automatically directed in the direction of the asteroid barrage, is heavily strained against an oncoming stream of space debris. One of the large pieces of debris penetrates the energy shield and collides with an unknown part of the ship, and the spaceship malfunctions. One passenger, mechanical engineer Jim Preston's sleeping pod opens. A holographic girl welcomes him, but he panics. The girl checks his body health and scans his body, then tells him you were sleeping for 120 years toward the Voyage New Space Colony. She tells him the ship is on its final approach for the next 4 months, you'll enjoy space travel, and she asks him not to remove his ID band on his wrist. Jim goes to his room where he scans his band to take out his luggage, and the virtual girl asks him to drink liquid to keep his essentials complete. The next day, Jim gets ready to explore the ship, and inside the hall alone where another holographic woman starts telling him about the new colony Homestead 2. Distraught, Jim asks her about the other passengers, but she doesn't answer him. Jim runs away and calls out to the others, but nobody's there. Jim takes the elevator to the other side of the ship to the Grand Hall, but there is no one there either. Taking information from a robot, he sees the ship's manager's room where no one is, after which he starts to check the control room, but there is also no one. He goes into a state where he discovers that he left Earth 30 years ago and will land on Homestead 2 in the next 90 years. Jim realizes he wakes up too soon and records a message to send to Earth for help, but the message to Earth will take 19 years to reach, and the earliest response is expected in 55 years. On his way there, a distraught Jim is delighted to see a man standing at the bar, but he turns out to be an indoor robot named Arthur. Jim tells it that he wakes up too soon and is not able to go back to hibernation either. Jim goes to breakfast where, being a normal passenger, he gets a normal coffee, then he gets in the car and goes to the ship's workshop. Jim finds the engineering manual for the hibernation pod and tries to fix it. As the pod lights up, he goes inside it, but the pod doesn't work and he comes out. He then tries to break the crew's room door, and the entry door is heavily fortified, which isn't open after trying many times. The ship's transport control lagged, but he didn't care and goes to Arthur for a drink. Jim has now been alone for several weeks and tells Arthur that he will die before he lands on another planet. Arthur tells him that you are worried about this, but nothing can be done now, so enjoy your time and enjoy the ship. Jim starts spending his time playing games, dancing, video games, and spending time in a luxury suite of the ship, with no company except Arthur. Jim has spent a year alone on the ship. He goes inside the room and wears a spacesuit to go out. He goes outside the ship and jumps off into space, but the safety cable pulls him back. Jim contemplates suicide by opening the space dock airlock without having his spacesuit on, but cannot bring himself to do it. Then he notices beautiful Aurora Lane in her pod, and her video profile reveals she is a writer with a humorous personality. Jim reads all his books and decides to unlock her pod for companionship, and Jim also discusses with Arthur about her. He stops himself from doing this, but one day, he unlocks her pod. Aurora wakes up and he runs to hide the pieces of equipment. Jim meets Aurora claiming her pod malfunctioned like his and shows her that she is awakened 89 years before. Aurora realizes that Jim has been awake for over a year as he explains all the things he has done to rectify his situation. Jim then asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that he wakes her up, and Arthur agrees on this. Aurora, devastated she may grow old and die before the ship reaches Homestead 2, attempts a fruitless effort at re-entering hibernation, just as Jim had tried. Eventually, she accepts her situation and begins writing a book about her experiences. Jim and Aurora grow closer. Jim does everything with her that he used to do alone, like video games, dance-offs, basketball, dinner dates, movies, etc., becoming lovers. Jim and Aurora enjoy their time together on the ship and even take space excursions together. Aurora is a gold-class passenger and has access to many amenities and far better menu options in the cafeteria that Jim never had access to, like better coffee and the swimming pool. Aurora says that colony planets are big business, and Homestead Company made $8 quadrillion from its first colony planet. Homestead gets 20% of everything a colonist makes in their lifetime on the new planet. Over the next year, the two fall in love. Just as Jim intends to propose to Aurora, he inadvertently allows Arthur to reveal the truth to Aurora. She is distraught, becomes angry with him, and starts to spend her time alone, and one night she physically attacks Jim. All this while, the malfunctions on the ship keep growing gradually. At first, they are barely noticeable, but one day Jim notices his room's control malfunctions but restores itself. One day when she is sitting next to Arthur and Jim arrives, Aurora leaves and watches her past videos which she recorded on Earth. Jim starts working on something and goes to Arthur for a drink, while Aurora sees a tree in the Grand Hall. Jim is in the elevator and it shuts down on the other hand. When Aurora orders coffee, the coffee machine also malfunctions, and the coffee beans start falling on the floor. Soon after, Gus, a chief deck officer, awakens and asks about the other passengers, but Jim tells him they are only 3 awake, and there are still 88 years to go. Gus takes them to the control room and sees that the ship is going in the right direction, but he can't find the data. Aurora tells him to go back, but Gus tells them we're traveling at 50% the speed of light, so it's impossible to go back to Earth. As soon as they arrive at the Grand Hall, the robots begin to break down and Jim explains that the ship has been malfunctioning for a long time. Hearing this, Gus gives them deck slates to sync the data and sends Jim and Aurora to decks. While Gus is checking to their pods, he tells Jim the timing chip of your chamber was damaged, and Gus realizes that Jim awakened Aurora. Aurora comes to return the slate and she blames Jim for stealing her life, claiming it is tantamount to murder. Gus does not condone Jim's actions but understands and tells Aurora that a drowning man will grab onto any lifeline. Suddenly Gus starts coughing and leaves for his room, but when he coughs again, blood comes out of his mouth, and he gets worried. During the night, Aurora goes swimming and the ship shuts down and she gets trapped in the water in the swimming pool due to loss of gravity. All the objects start flying, including Jim and Gus, while Aurora traps inside the water balloon and faints. Suddenly gravity restores in time and she barely escapes death, then both run to see Gus. After looking at the data, Gus tells them that a large part of the ship has been malfunctioning for a long time due to the gravitational pull that needs to be found and fixed. When Gus falls critically ill, the ship's automated medical suite, the Autodoc, diagnoses pansystemic necrosis, progressive organ failure, and gives him hours to live. Gus attributes it to his hibernation pod's multiple failures. Before dying, Gus gives Jim and Aurora his ID badge and employee code to access crew-only areas, so he and Aurora can try to repair the ship. The ship starts warning and they both run, but the gravitation pull makes it tough for them. They see Arthur malfunctioning and start breaking itself, but Jim removes its chip to stop it. Jim and Aurora find hull breaches from the asteroid collision 2 years earlier. They find a hole in the ship near the fusion reactor. The computer module administering the ship's fusion reactor power plant has been critically damaged due to the asteroid strike, causing cascading malfunctions as the other system's computing power was diverted in an attempt to maintain it. They replace the damaged module, but when the computer attempts to vent the reactor to extinguish a runaway plasma reaction, the exterior vent fails. Jim is forced to spacewalk and vent the plasma from outside, using the manual controls in the vent tube. Jim discovers that he must remain in the tube to keep the vent open while Aurora initiates venting from inside the ship. Revealing her enduring feelings for him, she admits she is terrified of losing him and being left alone. Jim improvises a heat shield and survives the venting but is blasted out into space as his tether snaps, and his damaged spacesuit begins losing oxygen. Aurora retrieves a clinically dead Jim from space and resurrects him in the Autodoc. The Avalon, its reactor repaired, returns to normal operations. After burying Gus in space, Jim learns the Autodoc can function as a hibernation pod for one person, and Jim insists that Aurora use it for the remainder of the voyage. Realizing she would never see Jim again, she chooses to remain awake with him. He presents her with the makeshift engagement ring he made earlier, which she accepts. 88 years later, the ship's passengers and crew awaken on schedule, shortly before arrival at Homestead 2. In the ship's grand concourse, they discover a huge tree with trailing vines, lush vegetation, flying birds, and a small cabin. A recording of Aurora's story describes the wonderful life she and Jim shared on the Avalon. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this.